The maid discovered that the millionaire only wanted to marry her to fulfill a clause in his father's will. However, over time, he truly fell in love. The sound of pens sliding across paper echoed in the luxurious meeting room of the Winters Corporation in Manhattan. Cashin Winters, the company's 35-year-old CEO, watched coolly as his housekeeper, Naomi Mitchell, signed what seemed to be the most important contract of their lives. "Are you sure about this, Miss Mitchell?" The deep voice of the lawyer, Maxwell Rodriguez, broke the tense silence. "A marriage contract is something quite serious, even if it is temporary." Naomi, 28, looked up from the document. Her fingers, calloused by years of hard work, gripped the pen tighter. "I am, Mr. Rodriguez. Absolutely sure." Cashin adjusted his navy blue tie, an automatic gesture that betrayed his nervousness. The family empire he had built had been at risk ever since his father's will had been revealed. The clause was clear. In order to retain full control of the company, he had to be married by his next birthday in 2 months' time. 2 years, Cashin repeated the terms of the agreement. "You stay married to me for 2 years, keep up appearances at social events, and in return you get $5 million at the end of the contract, plus monthly expenses covered during our arrangement." Naomi nodded, thinking of her younger brother, Lucas, who needed expensive heart surgery. Medical debts had eaten up all her savings, and her salary as a housekeeper, even at the Winters mansion on the Upper East Side, barely covered basic expenses. "The terms are clear," she replied, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "No emotional involvement, no physical intimacy, just a professional partnership with an end date." The lawyer collected the signed documents, storing them in his Italian leather briefcase. "I'll arrange the civil ceremony for next week. We'll keep everything discreet, as requested." When they were alone in the room, Cashin approached the window that offered a panoramic view of Central Park. "I appreciate your discretion over these 3 years working for me, Naomi. I know I can trust you to keep this situation confidential." "Don't worry, Mr. Winters. I'm a professional." Naomi stood up, smoothing her simple blue cotton dress. It was ironic how, in just a few days, she would go from maid to Mrs. Winters, even if only on paper. "Cashin," he corrected, turning to face her. "If we're going to make this work, you need to call me by my first name, at least in public." Their gazes met briefly. Naomi had always admired the determination in her boss's green eyes, even when she disagreed with his ruthless business decisions. Now, for the first time, she noticed a vulnerability there that caught her off guard. "I'll prepare your move to the master bedroom of the mansion," he continued, returning to his professional tone. "We'll keep separate rooms, but we need to keep up appearances for the servants." The following week, Naomi's life was turned upside down. The civil ceremony was quick and discreet, as promised. Her brother Lucas, the only person who knew the truth about the arrangement, served as a witness along with Maxwell Rodriguez. The move into the master bedroom was surreal. Naomi went from cleaning that space to occupying it, even though Cashin had moved into the guest room at the end of the corridor. The designer clothes he had provided now filled the closet that had previously held only his work uniforms. During dinner on her first official night as Mrs. Winters, sitting at the mahogany table where she used to serve meals, Naomi watched Cashin discreetly. He seemed distant, answering emails on his cell phone between mouthfuls of grilled salmon. "Tomorrow we have a charity event at the Metropolitan Museum," he informed her without lifting his eyes from the screen. "It will be our first public appearance as a couple. Maxwell has provided a compelling background story about how we fell in love during his duties at the house." Naomi swallowed, playing with the food on her plate. "And what would that story be?" "Love at first sight during a charity party where you worked. Secret meetings to protect your position. A discreet romance that blossomed naturally." Cashin finally faced her. The less elaborate the lie, the easier it is to maintain. The silence that followed was interrupted only by the clink of cutlery. Naomi thought about how her life had changed in just 1 week. From housekeeper to front wife for one of the most powerful men in New York. If her mother were alive, she probably wouldn't believe it. "Why me?" she asked suddenly. "Of all the women who could accept this deal, why did you choose your housekeeper?" Cashin put down his cell phone, considering the question. "You're discreet, efficient, and, Most importantly, reliable. In the last 3 years, you've never given cause to doubt your integrity. Besides, he paused, you need the money as much as I need this marriage. The blunt honesty of his response caught her off guard. It was true that every penny of the promised $5 million had already been earmarked. Lucas's surgery, the payment of his medical debts, and a fund to ensure that his brother could finish medical school. 2 years goes by fast, Cashin added, almost as if trying to convince himself. After that, you'll have your life back, with financial security, and I'll retain control of the company I built. Naomi nodded, but something in her chest tightened. 2 years of pretending to be in love with a man who barely saw her as a person until he needed her. 2 years of living an elaborate lie to satisfy the demands of an outdated will. As she climbed the stairs to her new room that night, Naomi couldn't have imagined that the biggest challenge wouldn't be keeping up appearances in public, but dealing with the unexpected feelings that would begin to blossom over the coming months. Not even Cashin, lying in the guest room, could have foreseen how the constant presence of that determined woman would begin to dismantle the walls he had built around his heart. The Metropolitan Museum of Art glowed under the lights of the Manhattan night. Naomi felt her heart race as she climbed the marble steps, her arm delicately entwined with Cashin's. The red Valentino dress, chosen by a hastily hired fashion consultant, made her feel like an imposter in her own skin. Breathe, Cashin murmured close to her ear, sensing her tension. You look stunning. No one will suspect a thing. The charity event was a crucial test for their marriage farce. The cream of New York society was present, including several members of the Winters Corporation Board. Naomi recognized some of the faces from the dinners she used to serve, now having to face them as equals. Cashin, darling, an elegant woman with platinum hair approached. So the rumors were true. You really did get married in secret? Victoria, Cashin greeted with a rehearsed smile. Yes, Naomi, and I wanted something intimate. You know how invasive the press can be. Victoria Arlington, a senior member of the council, studied Naomi with calculating eyes. And how did you two actually meet? I'm very curious about this lightning love story. Naomi felt Cashin's arm tense slightly. It was his cue. It was during the last charity event at the Winters mansion, she replied with a confidence she didn't know she possessed. I was supervising the service when Cashin spilled wine on his shirt. I ended up helping with the stain, and well, sometimes fate works in unexpected ways. The lie flowed naturally, seasoned with details that only someone who actually worked at the mansion would know. Victoria seemed satisfied with the answer, although her eyes still carried a shadow of doubt. As the evening progressed, Naomi was surprised by her own ability to adapt. Years of observing Manhattan's high society from the periphery of the parties had taught her more than she had imagined about their codes and behavior. You're doing extraordinarily well, Cashin commented during a slow dance, his hands resting respectfully on her waist. Even Victoria Arlington seems convinced. Years of serving champagne have their advantages, Naomi replied with a soft smile, aware of the glances on their faces. I've learned to read people, their expectations. For a moment, something changed in Cashin's gaze. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, not just as his former housekeeper or wife of convenience, but as someone with a depth and intelligence of her own. The moment was interrupted by Maxwell Rodriguez, who approached discreetly. We need to talk, he murmured. In private. They found a reserved corner next to an exhibition of modern art. The lawyer looked worried. Someone is investigating your marriage. Richard Sterling, from Sterling Media Group. Naomi felt her stomach sick. Sterling was known for exposing high society scandals in his publications. What exactly does he know? I'm not sure yet, Maxwell replied, running a hand through his gray hair. But he was asking questions about the ceremony, questioning the speed of the wedding. Cashin cursed softly. Sterling always wanted a reason to bring me down. Ever since I refused to sell shares to his media group, he's been trying to find something compromising. We need to be more convincing, Naomi concluded, surprising both men. If he's looking for holes in our story, let's give him a couple so in love that any suspicion will seem ridiculous. Cashin stared at her with a mixture of surprise and admiration. How? True love stories are unpredictable, impetuous, she explained, years of reading novels fueling her strategy. Let's make our story more spontaneous, less calculated. Returning to the salon, Naomi implemented her plan. When Cashin spoke to investors, she would surprise him with gentle touches on the arm or affectionate smiles. During conversations, she would share little stories of her time at the mansion, turning mundane moments into romantic encounters. "Remember that afternoon in the library?" she commented during a conversation with a group of socialites. Cashin was so engrossed in his reports that he didn't realize it was already dawn. "I ended up bringing him coffee and found him asleep on the documents." The smile Cashin gave him was surprisingly genuine. He completed the story naturally. "That's when I realized there was something special about you. Who else would worry like that?" As the evening progressed, the dynamic between them flowed more naturally. Naomi found that when she wasn't actively trying to pretend, it was easier to appear authentic. Cashin, for his part, began to show small gestures of affection that they hadn't rehearsed. A gentle touch on her back, a lingering look, a spontaneous smile. Towards the end of the event, Richard Sterling appeared. The media mogul, with his impeccable suit and predatory smile, greeted the couple. "What an unexpected union," he commented, studying them intently. "I imagine it was a real romantic whirlwind." "True love usually is," Naomi replied, leaning naturally against Cashin. "Some people can take years to find what we discovered in months." Sterling narrowed his eyes, but before he could ask any more questions, Cashin led her onto the dance floor. As they moved to the sound of the orchestra, Naomi noticed that her hands were shaking slightly. "You were amazing," Cashin whispered. Sterling couldn't find a loophole. "Yet," she replied, trying to keep a smile on her face. "He won't give up easily." Back at the mansion, late at night, Naomi removed her heels with a sigh of relief. Cashin watched her from across the entrance hall, his tie already loosened around his neck. "Thank you for tonight," he said at last. "You exceeded all expectations." Naomi nodded, holding her shoes in her hands. "We're a team now, aren't we? At least for the next 2 years." Something in the way he looked at her made her heart skip a beat. For a moment, it seemed that Cashin wanted to say something more, but instead, he just wished her good night and went upstairs to his room. Alone in her room, Naomi stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman who stared back at her, still in her Valentino dress, seemed both familiar and strange. In just one night, she had played the part of the love-struck wife with such conviction that, for a moment, even she almost believed the farce. As she removed her makeup, she couldn't help wondering how long they could keep up this charade, especially with Sterling watching them. More importantly, how long could she keep her heart protected when Cashin's every little gesture, however rehearsed, began to seem dangerously real? Richard Sterling's office occupied the top floor of a skyscraper in Times Square. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the flashing lights of the city looked like an ironic celebration as he studied the photos of Cashin and Naomi Winter's weddings spread out on his glass desk. "There's something wrong with this story," Sterling muttered to his assistant. "Nobody falls in love so conveniently when there are billions at stake." At the Winters mansion, Naomi was facing her own internal battle while organizing a charity party to be held that weekend. It was strange to be on the other side of the preparations, delegating tasks that until a few weeks ago had been her responsibility. Mrs. Winters, Martha, the new housekeeper, called out, "Where should I put the flowers for the centerpieces?" Naomi hesitated for a moment, still uncomfortable with the title. "Please, just call me Naomi." "And the flowers?" She stopped when Cashin entered the hall, looking worried. "We need to talk," he said, gesturing for her to follow him to his office. As soon as he closed the door, he handed her a magazine. "Sterling published this today." The article wasn't explicitly accusatory, but it raised questions about the speed of the wedding and the businessman's mysterious fiancée. There were old photos of Naomi in her housekeeper's uniform, contrasted with recent images of her at social events. "He's trying to put pressure on us," Cashin explained, running his hand through his dark hair. "He wants us to make a mistake." "So what do we do now?" Naomi asked, her heart racing. "We counterattack. The benefit will be our chance to show that we have nothing to hide." Cashin approached, his green eyes intense. But I need you to trust me completely." The plan was bold. Instead of trying to hide Naomi's past as an employee, they would turn it into part of their love story. During the party, they would share real memories of their time together at the mansion, only recontextualizing the moments in a romantic light. On the night of the event, Naomi came downstairs wearing a navy blue dress that made her brown eyes sparkle. Cashin was waiting for her at the foot of the stairs, and for a moment, his look of admiration seemed too genuine to be just acting. "Are you?" he began, but was interrupted by the arrival of the first guests. The evening flowed like a carefully choreographed dance. Cashin and Naomi circulated among the guests, sharing stories about how he always found excuses to visit the kitchen when she was working, or how she noticed his feelings growing during the long nights he stayed up late worrying about her well-being. "Actually," Naomi commented to a group of guests, feeling Cashin's hand firmly on her waist, "it was his dedication to the staff that first captivated me. He knows each person who works here by name. He knows about their families." The comment, although part of the act, carried a truth that surprised even Cashin. He really did care about his employees, something Naomi had always admired even before this arrangement. Richard Sterling appeared in the middle of the party, uninvited but impossible to bore without creating a scandal. His predatory smile contrasted with the cheerful atmosphere of the celebration. "What a fascinating story you have," he commented, studying the couple. "A modern Cinderella, isn't it? Although usually the prince doesn't need a wedding to keep his kingdom." Before Cashin could react, Naomi stepped forward. "You know, Mr. Sterling, some people have a hard time believing that true love can be born in the most unlikely places. Perhaps because they've never truly experienced it." The subtle jab made Sterling pale slightly. His recent messy divorce was public knowledge. Cashin watched in amazement as his wife of convenience disarmed the dreaded journalist with grace and wit. Later, when the last guest had left, Naomi found Cashin in the library, his usual haunt. He was pouring 2 glasses of whiskey. "You were extraordinary tonight," he said, offering her one of the glasses. "The way you handled Sterling, I've never seen anyone shut him up so elegantly." Naomi accepted the drink, feeling the amber liquid gently burn her throat. "I've learned a few things about people like him over the years. Sometimes the best defense is to show that their attempts at intimidation don't affect you." Cashin studied her for a moment, as if trying to decipher a particularly intriguing puzzle. "You continue to amaze me, Naomi. When I proposed this arrangement, I never imagined—" "What?" she asked when he didn't complete his thought. "That I would find a real partner," he finally replied. "Someone who doesn't just play a role, but who really understands and contributes to it all." The moment of vulnerability between them was interrupted by Martha informing them that Lucas, Naomi's brother, was on the phone. It was about the results of the last tests before the surgery. As Naomi hurried out of the library, Cashin stood watching the door through which she had left, his expression pensive. In the hallway, before answering the phone, Naomi tried to calm her racing heart, not knowing if it was because she was worried about her brother or because of the intimate moment she had just shared with her husband of convenience. The line between acting and reality was beginning to blur dangerously, and they both knew that this could significantly complicate their previously well-defined agreement. Lucas' call changed everything that night. Naomi held the phone tightly as she listened to her brother explain that the costs of the surgery had increased significantly. New complications had been discovered, requiring a more complex and specialized procedure. "We need another $300,000, Lucas said, his voice shaking. "I know it's a lot, but the doctors say we can't wait any longer." Naomi closed her eyes, leaning against the corridor wall. The agreement with Cashin stipulated that she would only receive the $5 million at the end of the 2 years. How could she explain that she needed the money now? "I'll find a way," she promised her brother, even though she didn't know how she would keep that promise. When she hung up, she found Cashin standing in the doorway of the library, watching her with an indecipherable expression. "Is everything all right?" "Not really," Naomi replied, deciding to be honest. "I need to talk to you about something important." In the library, she explained the situation, trying to keep her voice steady as she detailed the new complications in Lucas' condition. Cashin listened to her in silence, pouring himself another drink. "Why didn't you tell me before about the seriousness of the situation?" he finally asked. Because our agreement is strictly professional, Naomi replied. You're not responsible for my family's problems. Cashin placed his glass on the table with more force than necessary. You're my wife now, even if only on paper. How do you think it would look if your brother died because I refused to advance part of the payment? The practical way he put it caught her off guard. Of course, for Cashin, it was all about appearances and business. Still, there was something in his eyes that suggested more than mere calculation. I'll transfer the money tomorrow, he decided. Consider it in advance on our deal. Thank you, Naomi whispered, tears threatening to fall. I promise. Don't promise anything, Cashin interrupted her, his voice surprisingly gentle. Just trust me, okay? The next morning, while they were having breakfast on the balcony overlooking the garden, Maxwell Rodriguez appeared unannounced. His grave expression indicated trouble. Sterling is digging deeper, the lawyer announced, throwing another magazine on the table. He found out about the clause in the will. Naomi felt her stomach sink as she read the headline, Marriage of Convenience? The real reason behind the Winters Union. How did he get this information? Cashin demanded, his face red with anger. Someone from the law firm leaked the documents, Maxwell explained. We've already identified the person responsible, but the damage is done. Naomi's cell phone started ringing incessantly with social media notifications. The story was spreading fast, and nasty comments were already starting to appear. This could affect the company's shares, Cashin muttered, wiping his hands across his face. The board will want explanations. And it will affect Naomi's reputation, Maxwell added. The press will paint her as an opportunist. I don't care what they say about me, Naomi interjected, surprising both men, but we can't let it damage the company. Not after all your work, Cashin. Something about the way she prioritized his interests touched Cashin deeply. Before he could reply, his phone rang and it was Victoria Arlington calling an emergency board meeting. I'm coming with you, Naomi declared as he stood up to get ready. You don't have to do that, Cashin replied. It's hard enough. I'm your wife, she interrupted him, her voice firm. Whether by contract or not, we're in this together. I'm not going to let you face this alone. In the car on the way to Winters Corporation, Naomi noticed how tense Cashin looked, his fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. On an impulse, she covered his hand with hers. It'll be all right, she assured him. We can turn this to our advantage. How? By being honest to a certain extent. Yes, the will was a catalyst, but that doesn't mean that what we've built since then is false. Cashin stared at her for a moment, something indefinable in his gaze. What have we built? A partnership, Naomi replied softly. Trust. Maybe it's not the conventional love everyone expects, but it's something real. In the elevator going up to the boardroom, Cashin held Naomi's hand again, this time of his own volition. The gesture, though small, carried significant weight. Thank you, he murmured before the doors opened. For everything? Naomi just nodded, her heart pounding wildly. As they walked to face the council, she realized that her biggest concern was no longer keeping up appearances or protecting the deal. It was protecting Cashin, the man who, without realizing it, was beginning to break down all her carefully constructed defenses. The doors to the boardroom opened, revealing serious faces and newspapers spread out on the meeting table. The moment of truth had arrived, and for the first time since signing that contract, Naomi and Cashin would face the consequences not as actors in an elaborate play, but as true partners united against adversity. The Winters Corporation boardroom vibrated with tension as Victoria Arlington finished reading the latest headline aloud. Naomi remained seated next to Cashin, their hands still joined under the polished mahogany table, a gesture that had begun as mutual support but now felt like an anchor for both of them. So, Victoria closed the magazine with a snap. Do you have anything to say for yourselves? Cashin was preparing to speak when Naomi stood up, surprising everyone. Actually, yes. I have a lot to say. Naomi, Cashin began, but she silenced him with a determined look. Yes, there was a clause in the will, she admitted, staring at each member of the council. And yes, it did influence the timing of our wedding. But do you know what Sterling didn't find out? That over the last 3 years, I've watched Cashin turn this company into something extraordinary. The room fell completely silent as Naomi continued. I saw nights when he slept in his office to make sure no employees were laid off during the recession. I saw when he sold his yacht to set up a medical emergency fund for his employees. So tell me, why wouldn't I marry a man like that? Victoria Arlington adjusted her gold-rimmed glasses, studying Naomi with new interest. Impressive, but that doesn't change the fact that the marriage was motivated by financial interest. Like yours to the late Mr. Arlington? Naomi retorted softly. Forgive me, but everyone in this room knows that marriages in high society rarely start out of love. The difference is that some of us are honest about it. A murmur went through the room. Cashin watched his wife with a mixture of admiration and something deeper, something he wasn't yet ready to name. The shares have fallen 3% since the story was published, reported another board member. And they're up 45% since I took over, Cashin finally intervened, standing up next to Naomi. This board has known me for years. They know that every decision I make is for the good of the company and the people who depend on it. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, but the tide had turned. Naomi's calculated sincerity, combined with Cashin's impeccable track record, convinced the majority of the board to support them. In the elevator, descending the 60 floors in silence, Cashin finally spoke up. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Naomi replied, still shaking slightly from the adrenaline rush. Because it was the truth. The drive home was interrupted by a sudden thunderstorm that forced them to stop at a small cafe on the Upper West Side. Sitting by the window, watching the rain punish the city, they both processed the day's events. How did you know about the yacht? Cashin asked suddenly. Martha told me, Naomi admitted. She said you asked for complete secrecy about the sale. You didn't want the employees to feel indebted. Something changed in Cashin's eyes. You really paid attention, didn't you? Even before all that. It was impossible not to notice, she replied, toying with the coffee cup in her hands. You try so hard to appear cold and calculating, but your actions always betray you. Thunder echoed through the city, causing the cafe lights to flicker. Naomi startled, and Cashin instinctively covered her hand with his. You know, he began, his voice softer than usual. When I planned this arrangement, I thought it would be simple. One contract, mutual benefits, no complications. And it's not being simple? No, he admitted, his green eyes fixed on hers. Because you're making it impossible to keep it just professional. The moment was interrupted by Naomi's cell phone was Lucas, with news about the surgery. Thanks to Cashin's advance, the procedure was scheduled for next week. I need to be there with him, she said after hanging up. We will be, Cashin corrected. At her surprised look, he added, as you said, we're partners now, and partners support each other. Back at the mansion, late at night, Naomi stopped before climbing the stairs to her room. Cashin? He turned around, his tie already loosened. Yes. Thank you. For today, for Lucas, for everything. For a moment, it seemed as if he was going to say something more, take a step towards her, break down one of the many barriers that still existed between them. But another clap of thunder echoed through the mansion, breaking the spell of the moment. In her bedroom, Naomi stared at her reflection in the mirror as she removed her earrings. The woman staring back at her was no longer just the housekeeper playing a role. She was someone who was beginning to understand that sometimes the best scripts are those that life writes without our permission. In the next room, Cashin lay awake, going over every word Naomi had said at the council, every glance exchanged over coffee, every little moment that was, without his permission, turning their business deal into something dangerously close to the real thing. The storm continued outside, but inside the Winters mansion, a different storm was just beginning, one that no contract could predict or control. Mount Sinai Hospital rose against the cloudy Manhattan sky as Naomi and Cashin crossed the parking lot towards the main entrance. It was the day of Lucas's surgery, and Naomi's anxiety was palpable in the way she tightened the strap of her purse. He's in good hands, Cashin assured her, his hand resting lightly on her back. The gesture, which should only have been comforting, sent a shiver down Naomi's spine. Lucas was being prepped for surgery when they arrived in the room. His young face lit up at the sight of his sister, but his eyebrows rose in surprise when he noticed Cashin. "So the famous brother-in-law did come," Lucas commented with a faint smile. "I read about you in the papers this week." "Lucas," Naomi warned softly, but Cashin stepped forward. "Your sister defended our family with more courage than anyone I've ever met," he said, his voice carrying a sincerity that surprised even Naomi. "You're lucky to have her as a sister." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of the medical team. As they prepared Lucas to take him to the operating room, Naomi held her brother's hand tightly. "I'll be here when you wake up," she promised, fighting back tears. The next few hours were a torture of waiting. Cashin canceled all his meetings for the day, remaining by Naomi's side in the waiting room. When she started walking nervously down the corridor, he gently guided her to the hospital cafeteria. "You need something to eat," he insisted, ordering sandwiches and coffee for them both. "I can't," Naomi replied, playing with her napkin. "Lucas is all I have left of the family. If anything happens—" "Nothing will happen," Cashin interrupted her, covering her hand with his on the table. "And you're not alone, Naomi. Not anymore." The look they exchanged carried a different weight, something that went beyond their agreement of convenience. Before they could explore that moment, Cashin's cell phone rang, and it was Maxwell with more news about Sterling. "He's planning a new story," Cashin informed him after hanging up. "Apparently he found records of the bank transfers to the hospital." Naomi felt her stomach sick. "Is he going to use Lucas's surgery against us?" "Not if I can stop it," Cashin replied, his voice harsh. "Maxwell is preparing a restraining order. Sterling has gone too far." Back in the waiting room, the hours dragged by. Naomi dozed off briefly, her exhausted body giving in to fatigue. When she woke up, she realized she was leaning on Cashin's shoulder, silently working on his laptop. "Sorry," she mumbled, straightening up. "Don't be sorry," he replied softly. "You need to rest." The surgeon finally appeared after 8 hours of procedure. "The surgery was a success," he announced with a tired smile. "Lucas is young and strong. With proper rehabilitation, he should make a full recovery." The relief was so intense that Naomi's knees went weak. Cashin quickly supported her, his arms wrapping around her in an instinctive hug. For a moment, she allowed herself to melt against his chest, inhaling his familiar scent which, somehow, had become synonymous with safety. When they finally saw Lucas in the ICU, he was drowsy but conscious. Naomi held his hand as he struggled to keep his eyes open. "Hey, little brother," she whispered, pushing his hair away from his forehead. "You did it." Lucas looked past her to Cashin, who stood near the door. "Take care of her," he murmured before falling asleep again. On the way home, the silence in the car was different from the previous ones, more comfortable, more intimate. When they arrived at the mansion, the exhaustion of the day finally caught up with Naomi. Her legs trembled as she climbed the stairs. "Let me help," Cashin offered, his arm around her waist. The contact was unnecessary, but neither of them made any mention of moving away. At the door to Naomi's room, they stopped. The moment called for a decision to continue as they were, maintaining the carefully established boundaries of their agreement, or to recognize that something had fundamentally changed between them. "Thank you for today," Naomi said softly. "For everything?" Cashin studied her face for a moment, his expression intense. "Naomi, The sound of a door slamming downstairs startled them. It was Martha, arriving for her night shift. The moment shattered like crystal. "Good night," Cashin finally said, taking a step back. Alone in her room, Naomi stared at her reflection in the mirror as she prepared for bed. The woman who stared back at her seemed different, no longer just a piece in an elaborate game of appearances, but someone who was beginning to feel things that weren't in the contract. In his own room, Cashin lay awake, going over the events of the day. The way Naomi had fit perfectly in his arms, the absolute trust Lucas had placed in him, the paralyzing fear of losing her that had assailed him when he saw her collapse in the waiting room. The contract that bound them together now seemed a flimsy document, inadequate to contain what was growing between them, something deeper, truer, and infinitely more frightening than any business agreement. Night was advancing over Manhattan, and in separate rooms of the Winters mansion, Two hearts struggled to keep intact barriers that were already beginning to crumble. Richard Sterling stared at the photo on his desk with almost maniacal intensity. The image captured Cashin and Naomi at Mount Sinai Hospital, the businessman holding his wife in an embrace that seemed too intimate to be just an act. "Something doesn't fit," he muttered, running his fingers over the photograph. "Nobody's that good an actor." At the Winters mansion, a week after Lucas's surgery, Naomi was organizing documents in her office when she found a folder marked Project Phoenix. Normally, she wouldn't go through confidential documents, but a loose piece of paper caught her eye. It was a memo dated 3 months before her marriage to Cashin. Merger proposal with Sterling Media Group projected. Reason: unacceptable conditions include mass layoff of operational staff. "Have you found anything interesting?" Cashin's voice startled her. He was standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Sorry, I shouldn't." "No," he interrupted her, stepping closer. "You have a right to know. Sterling wanted to merge our companies, but his conditions included laying off 30% of employees to optimize costs. That's why he's so intent on destroying us," Naomi concluded. "You chose to protect your employees rather than do the deal." Cashin leaned on the table, too close for Naomi's comfort. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "See through all the layers I've built up. Understand my decisions better than I do myself." The moment was interrupted by Naomi's cell phone. It was the hospital informing her that Lucas had been discharged and could go home. "I'll come with you to pick him up," Cashin declared before she could say anything. On the way to the hospital, Naomi noticed how tense Cashin looked, his hands gripping the steering wheel with unnecessary force. "Something wrong?" "Maxwell called earlier," he replied after a moment. "Sterling is calling a press conference for tomorrow. Apparently he has bombshell revelations about our marriage." Naomi's heart raced. "What can we do?" "We can hold our own press conference first," Cashin suggested, turning briefly to face her. "Tell our story on our terms." "Our real story?" The question hung in the air, loaded with unspoken meanings. What was their real story anyway? The contract that brought them together? Or something deeper that was growing between them? At the hospital, they found Lucas already dressed and anxious to leave. He watched with interest the dynamic between his sister and Cashin. The glances exchanged, the small but meaningful gestures, the way they seemed to orbit each other unconsciously. "So," Lucas commented when they were in the car, "how long before you admit it?" "Admit what?" Naomi asked, tension in her voice. "That this marriage stopped being just a contract a long time ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Cashin kept his eyes fixed on the road, but his fingers gripped the steering wheel even tighter. Naomi pretended to be engrossed in her message. Back at the mansion, Lucas was installed in one of the guest rooms on the first floor, with nurses hired to help him recover. While Naomi helped him settle in, Cashin prepared the press conference with Maxwell. "We need to be completely transparent," Cashin insisted. "No more lies." "Are you sure?" Maxwell asked, studying his client carefully. "This could change everything." "Everything has already changed," Cashin replied softly, his gaze wandering to where Naomi was talking to one of the nurses in the corridor. That evening, after dinner, Cashin found Naomi in the library. She was sitting in her favorite armchair, a forgotten book on her lap as she watched the city through the window. "We need to talk about tomorrow," he said, sitting down next to her. "About the press conference?" "About us?" The word hung between them like an unanswered question. Naomi finally turned to face him, finding in his eyes a vulnerability she had never seen before. "What exactly are we, Cashin?" "I don't know," he admitted, running a hand through his hair in a nervous gesture. "I just know that when we signed that contract, I never imagined that you would become indispensable." Naomi's heart raced. "Indispensable to keep up appearances?" "Indispensable to me," he corrected, his voice low but intense. "For everything." Before they could explore that revelation, Martha hurried into the library. "Gentlemen, you need to see this." On TV, Richard Sterling was giving a live interview in advance of his press conference. "Tomorrow, New York will learn the truth about the Winters marriage. A story of manipulation, lies, and..." Cashin turned off the TV, his face a mask of determination. Let's not wait until tomorrow. Let's do our interview now. Now? Naomi asked, surprised. Now. No preparation, no rehearsed script, just the truth. While Maxwell made the necessary calls to organize a last-minute interview, Naomi and Cashin remained in the library, the silence between them laden with unspoken words and feelings about to overflow. The truth was about to come out, but which truth? That of the contract that bound them together, or that of the hearts that, without permission, had begun to beat in the same rhythm? The cameras in CNN's Manhattan studio focused on Cashin and Naomi, sitting side by side on the hastily improvised set for the exclusive interview. Host Diana Collins, known for her incisive approach, was adjusting her headset as production made the final preparations to go live. 3, 2, 1. The director signaled and the red camera lights came on. Good evening, America. We interrupt our program for an exclusive interview with Cashin and Naomi Winters, who have decided to respond to the accusations that have been circulating about their marriage. Cashin, why have you chosen to speak now? Cashin leaned forward slightly, his hand finding Naomi's instinctively. Because it's time for the truth, Diana. Not the twisted truth that others want to tell, but our truth. And what is that truth? Diana pressed, her sharp eyes catching the intertwining of the couple's fingers. The truth is that our marriage began as an arrangement, Naomi replied, her firm voice surprising even Cashin. I was a housekeeper at the Winters mansion, and Cashin needed to get married to keep control of the company due to a clause in his father's will. A heavy silence fell over the studio. Diana Collins leaned forward, feeling that she was about to get the scoop of the year. So Richard Sterling was right? It was all a hoax? No, Cashin interrupted, his gaze meeting Naomi's. The beginning may have been a deal, but what happened afterwards, that nobody planned? Explain it better, Diana encouraged, noticing the growing tension between the couple. You can't plan to truly get to know someone, Cashin continued, his voice carrying an emotion that surprised even Naomi. You can't predict what it will be like to wake up every morning and discover something new about a person. How she always leaves a cup of coffee on your desk before important meetings. How she knows every employee by name and genuinely cares about their families. Naomi felt her heart race with every word. This wasn't in the script they had discussed in the car on the way to the studio. What about you, Naomi? Diana turned to her. What did you find out about Cashin that wasn't in the contract? I found out that behind the ruthless businessman is a man who sold his yacht to set up a medical fund for employees, she replied, unshed tears glistening in her eyes. A man who spent hours in hospital during my brother's surgery, not because he needed to keep up appearances, but because he cared. The cameras caught every glance exchanged, every breath held, every moment of vulnerability that unfolded live from millions of viewers. So when exactly did the real feelings start? Diana asked softly. I can't say, Naomi admitted. Maybe when he held my hand during the first benefit, not because we needed to convince anyone, but because he knew I was nervous. Or maybe he was always there, even before the contract, just waiting for the right moment. Cashin turned completely towards her, ignoring the cameras. Why didn't you ever tell me that? For the same reason you never told me why you actually turned down the merger with Sterling, she replied. Fear of complicating something that should be simple. The intimate moment was interrupted by Diana's cell phone, which vibrated with an urgent notification. We've just received information that Richard Sterling is holding his own press conference right now. The split screen showed an image of Sterling in his office, brandishing documents. I have proof here that the Winters marriage was an elaborate fraud. Bank transfers, the original contract? Yes, I made bank transfers, Cashin interrupted him, his voice echoing in the studio, to pay for Naomi's brother's heart surgery. And yes, there is a contract. But you know what's not in the contract, Sterling? The way my heart races when Naomi walks into the room. How her smile has become the best part of my day. How the thought of losing her terrifies me more than losing the company. The silence that followed was deafening. Sterling, for the first time, seemed speechless. Diana Collins had tears in her eyes, as did much of the production team. I think we have our answer, Diana concluded softly. Sometimes love is born in the most unexpected places, even when we start with a contract. After the interview, in the car driving home, The silence between Cashin and Naomi was laden with unplanned confessions and exposed feelings. "Did you mean it?" Naomi finally asked. "About all that?" Cashin parked the car in the driveway of the mansion, turning to face her. "Every word. And you?" "Every word," she whispered. The space between them seemed electrified, years of pent-up feelings about to overflow. But before they could take the next step, Lucas appeared in the doorway of the mansion, leaning on his cane. "You need to see this," he called out, a knowing smile on his face. Inside the mansion, all the news channels were echoing the interview. Social media exploded with hashtags about the Winters couple, most of them supporting their honesty and courage. "I think we've just rewritten our history," Cashin commented, watching the reactions on TV. "No," Naomi corrected gently. "We just started telling the real one." The morning after the CNN interview dawned with a different Manhattan for Cashin and Naomi. The headlines of the main newspapers highlighted their public confession, with analysis and speculation about the couple who turned a business deal into a true love story. "The phones keep ringing," Maxwell reported during an emergency meeting in the mansion's library. "All the major magazines want exclusive interviews. And most surprisingly, the company's shares have risen by 12% since last night." Cashin, however, was barely paying attention. His eyes kept being drawn to Naomi, who was sitting by the window, apparently absorbed in her own thoughts. Since the televised confession, they had barely spoken, as if they were both afraid of breaking the delicate balance between what they were and what they could be. "Sterling dropped all charges," Maxwell continued. "Apparently, your honesty resonated with the public in a way they didn't expect." "What about the council?" Naomi asked, finally joining the conversation. "Victoria Arlington called personally," Maxwell smiled. "She said she'd never seen anything so genuine in New York high society. The board is totally on your side." After Maxwell left, the silence in the library became almost palpable. Cashin approached the window where Naomi stood, looking out over the mansion's gardens. "We need to talk about yesterday," he began. "Do we?" Naomi turned to face him. "Or can we keep pretending it was just another strategy to save the company?" The vulnerability in her voice made something inside Cashin twitch. "Do you think that's what it was? A strategy?" "I don't know what to think anymore, Cashin. We started out with such a clear, defined contract. And now the contract seems like the least important part of all this," he added, taking another step towards her. The moment was interrupted by Lucas, who entered the library leaning on his cane. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's something you need to see." On the tablet Lucas was carrying, a viral video showed compilations of Cashin and Naomi's moments at public events over the last few months. Small gestures, exchanged glances, discreet smiles, all captured on camera and now analyzed by millions of people who saw in them signs of a genuine love gradually growing. "Sometimes we need others to show us what's right in front of us," Lucas commented before leaving them alone again. Naomi felt her hands tremble slightly as she watched the images. Every moment captured brought back a vivid memory. The way Cashin always adjusted his posture when she entered a room, how his eyes instinctively sought her out at social events, how their hands seemed to find excuses to touch. "When exactly did we lose control of this situation?" she whispered. "Maybe we never had control to begin with," Cashin replied, finally eliminating the distance between them. "Maybe the contract was just an excuse for the inevitable." Cashin's phone rang, interrupting the moment. It was Victoria Arlington, calling an urgent board meeting. Apparently, Sterling Media Group was proposing a new merger offer, this time with more favorable terms. "I'm coming with you," Naomi declared when he mentioned the meeting. "You don't have to. That's company business." "I'm your wife," she interrupted him, her voice firm. "Contract or not, we're in this together. Remember?" In the car on the way to Winters Corporation, the silence between them was laden with unspoken words. Naomi watched Cashin's profile as he drove, noticing the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the steering wheel. "What was the first time," she asked suddenly, "first time, that you realized it had become more than an agreement?" Cashin remained silent for a few moments before answering. "At the Metropolitan Benefit, when you defended that waiter who knocked over a tray. The way you protected him, the way you cared, I realized I was falling in love with the same person who had always been there, even before the contract. The confession hung between them like an unfulfilled promise, interrupted by their arrival at the company building. In the elevator going up to the boardroom, their hands met naturally, as if their bodies knew something that their minds were still struggling to accept. Victoria Arlington was waiting for them at the entrance to the boardroom, an enigmatic smile on her red lips. "Before we go in," she said, "I want you to know that the council has already made its decision. The question is, have you made yours?" The question echoed through the halls of the Winters Corporation, carrying a weight that went far beyond corporate mergers and marriage contracts. It was time to decide not only the future of the company, but the future of two hearts that had found love in the most unexpected place between the pages of a contract that now seemed as insignificant as the autumn leaves dancing outside Manhattan windows. The Winters Corporation boardroom was silent as Victoria Arlington presented the new terms proposed by Sterling Media Group. Naomi watched Cashin discreetly, noticing how his posture had changed in the last 24 hours. He was no longer the calculating businessman protected by layers of coldness, but a man who had finally allowed his true emotions to surface. "The offer is substantially better than the previous one," Victoria concluded. "No mass layoffs, maintenance of employee benefit policies, and Sterling gives up majority control." "Why the sudden change?" Cashin asked, his hands still intertwined with Naomi's under the table. "Because yesterday you did something that Sterling has never managed in his entire career. You won the hearts of the public by simply being honest," Victoria replied with a knowing smile. "Public opinion is on Winter's side, and he's smart enough to recognize a strategic defeat." As the board discussed the technical details of the proposal, Naomi felt her cell phone vibrate. It was a message from Lucas with a link to yet another viral video, this time a compilation of reactions to his CNN interview, with people sharing their own love stories born in unlikely circumstances. "The board needs your final decision, Mr. Winters," Maxwell announced, bringing everyone's attention back to the meeting. Cashin stood up, adjusting his suit in a familiar gesture that now seemed charged with new meaning. "Before I decide on the future of the company, I need to sort out something more important." He turned to Naomi, holding out his hand. "Will you accompany me to my office?" The buzz of speculation filled the room as they left. In the private elevator that led to the president's floor, the silence between them was charged with anticipation. Cashin's office, with its panoramic view of Manhattan, had witnessed countless important decisions over the years, but none seemed as crucial as the one that was about to take place. "Remember the day we signed our contract?" Cashin asked, walking over to his safe built into the wall. "How could I forget?" Naomi replied, watching him type in the combination. Cashin pulled out a familiar folder, the original contract that had brought their lives together so unexpectedly. "That day, I thought I was just protecting the company. I had no idea I was signing the document that would change my life completely." "Cashin, please let me finish," he asked softly. "I spent years building walls around myself, convinced that success in business meant keeping emotions under control. Then you came into my life first as a housekeeper, then as part of this deal, and finally," he paused, his eyes meeting hers, "as the person who broke down every wall I built." With a deliberate movement, Cashin began to tear up the contract, page by page. Naomi watched, her heart racing with each destroyed sheet. "What are you doing?" "Ending our agreement," he replied, letting the pieces fall into the garbage can. "Because I want to start something new, something real, without clauses or conditions." Naomi felt tears forming in her eyes. "What if it doesn't work out? What about the company?" "The company will survive," Cashin replied, moving closer. "But me? I don't know if I could survive losing you now that I've discovered what it's really like to have you in my life." The sound of Manhattan outside seemed distant as they stared at each other, years of pent-up feelings finally finding their moment of release. "So, Naomi Mitchell," Cashin continued, his voice trembling slightly, "will you start a new story with me? No contracts, no obligations, just us?" Her answer came in the form of a kiss, her first real kiss, no longer limited by agreements or appearances. When they parted, they were both smiling through their tears. "I think we need to get back to the meeting," Naomi whispered after a few moments. Yes, Cashin agreed, interlacing his fingers with hers. We have a company to run. Together. Back in the boardroom, the decision to accept Sterling's new proposal was unanimous. But for everyone present, it was clear that the real victory that day had nothing to do with mergers or business deals. That night, the Winters mansion was different. Lucas watched with a satisfied smile as his sister and Cashin shared a candlelit dinner in the garden, no longer as part of an elaborate act, but as two people who had finally found their way to each other. You know, Naomi commented as Cashin poured more wine, I still can't believe how everything has changed in such a short time. I can, he replied, his eyes shining in the candlelight, because for the first time in my life, something makes complete sense. The lights of Manhattan shone in the background, silent witnesses to a story that began with a contract but ended up proving that true love can't be controlled, planned, or contained on pages of paper. Sometimes, it simply happens at the most unexpected moments, in the most unlikely places, turning commercial agreements into promises from the heart. And so, between the gardens of the Winters mansion and the skyscrapers of Manhattan, Cashin and Naomi discovered that sometimes the best chapters of our lives begin when we throw away the script and allow our hearts to write the story.